Now this is a sword. More specifically, it's a medieval sword. This design was first seen over 1,000 years ago. And to add my own flair, I'm going to be creating a pattern that resembles a pillar of fire. Without any further ado, let's light the forge. I'm starting this project with two different types of steel, 1075 and 15 and 20 high carbon steels. This initial steel selection is basically like choosing the DNA for the entire project. Now that every piece has been cut, we can make our initial stack. For this, I'm going to alternate the layers before using a MIG welder to tack everything together for our forge weld later on. Alright, so now our billet's been tack welded together. Now we're going to go ahead, heat it up, and forge weld it. Woo! It's very important that we don't rush this initial forge weld, as everything else we do in this project will be stacked upon the shoulders of this step.
Woo! Hot! It's not quite at welding heat yet. So what I'm going to do is sprinkle some flux on there since I have open seams. And that'll help to dissolve that forge scale that's forming in between the layers as I speak. Back in the forge.
So what I'm doing here in this first pass is basically just going through and setting the weld. Now that being said, you can actually see a little bit of flux shoot out there from the side of the billet. This is good, as that means that the flux isn't trapped between the layers, preventing the thing from forge welding together. The next step is to then draw this down into a more manageable bar.
Oh, that looks awesome! Oh my goodness! Are you seeing this? What I'm going to do next is once it's down into a comfortable thickness, I'm going to chop it in half and we're going to twist them opposite directions. This is going to be a multi-bar twisted core. Now again, I'm trying to kind of plan it out in my head, but Damascus is such an organic process that I don't really know what the final product's gonna look like. And that's the exciting thing, is because no matter what I do, it's gonna come out with its own sort of characteristics and traits that you can't get any other way. So I am absolutely pumped, and let's continue to work this thing down. Let's do it. All right, so on that twist, I went this way, clockwise. On this one, I need to go this way, counterclockwise.
Now the next step is to get these twisted down to a nice, tight, but even finish. This is so that when we put them together, the pattern is consistent the whole way down the length of the blade. I'm then going to use some more flux and the press to squish these down into rectangular bars that'll make it easier when we stack them later on. Now when I put these together, they should meet up like chevrons down the length of the bars. Now that our bars have been twisted, the next step we're going to do is take some 15 and 20 and 1075 again and basically cut out some bars to add to our overall pattern. The aim that I'm going for is a 1075 center, the two twisted multi-bars on the outside, and then having another piece of 1075 on either end, and then being cladded in some edge bars in 15 and 20. Now what this will do is it'll isolate the twisted bars in the middle and create this really interesting effect that whenever we etch it, you won't actually see the differentiation between the 1075. You only see the high bright spots of the 15 and 20 in the twist. This is one of the trickiest forge welds in the entire process, and I'm going to proceed slowly as I slowly start to condense it down on itself and draw it out into its final length of the blade. I faced a lot of issues here where the billet almost wanted to crinkle down on itself, almost like a strand of spaghetti, so I had to keep kind of gently working it from the flat and then back up on top. That way I kept everything nice and straight, but I still ended up with some serious distortion later on in the pattern.
Alright, so I went ahead and stopped mid-forging process, and that's so I can cut in the fish mouth. Now a fish mouth is something that's done historically, basically to bookmark the ends. What it'll do is I'll cut out a V shape, and then I'll slowly bring those down before forge welding them, and then I'll make sure my end bars meet up right at the tip of the blade.
Now this is a really cool process, because essentially you're forging it down while it's hot, sprinkling a little bit of flux in there, and then forge welding it together. Now a little tip whenever you're doing fish mouths, if it doesn't take the first time, don't panic, just simply get it hot again, sprinkle more flux in there, and try again. This kind of process is a very nitty-gritty kind of forge weld, as you're working it hot, which is never good whenever you're trying to prevent oxidation. Another trick that I used though is I actually pushed a lot more fuel into my forge to hopefully create a reducing atmosphere. That way there wouldn't be as much oxidation due to excess oxygen in the forge. Now that the forge weld has taken though, I'm going to finish out forging down the blade. Now another thing you're going to be seeing me do here is I'm actually going to be welding on a piece of softer steel on the base of the tang. This is so later, whenever I go to assemble the sword and I have to pin the tang down over the pommel, I don't have a lot of issues with it. Now it's really crucial to note here that although I'm MIG welding this, I'm going to chamfer the edges so that I get really good penetration with the weld, as well as heat it back up and forge it all down. That way the grain structure isn't stressed because of the MIG welding process. Anytime you introduce welding onto a finished piece, you need to make sure that you normalize that area, as welding like this generally creates a lot of stress points in the steel.
The sword has been forged! Yeah!
Now that the blade has been fully forged, the next step is to thin it out slightly before heat treating. Now once this has been done, you'll see I'm left with lots of steel dust. Pretty gnarly that it actually ended up in a ball like this. The next step then is to go in for the quench. So I'm first going to normalize it 3 times, bringing it up to about 1600 degrees, then 1500, and then 1400. Doing this by eye, it's very important that you do this in a low light environment so that you can properly gauge temperature and not screw up the grain of your steel.
So we ran out of propane, but I went ahead and got the tank filled, and now we're gonna go ahead and relight the forge and quench the sword. So let's quench it.
I'm going to go in and vigorously oscillate it in the oil while keeping it submerged so we don't get one of these nice fireballs to happen. And then I'm going to immediately go over to some 2x4s that are in my post vise, and that's to help hold things straight while it cools down the rest of the way. Now the quench has gone well, the next step is to temper it before thinning it out and beginning our final grinds. Now once it's down closer to the final thickness, I'm going to be laying out some guidelines for my fuller. Something you're going to see me do is use an angle grinder to make my initial starting line in the middle of the blade. This just acts as a guideline that helps me to index whenever I use the small wheel later. This is a trick that I saw Seth Lopez put on his Instagram at one point, and it's pretty nifty. It's very important to do the fuller before you do your bevels, as bevels act as a sort of self-correcting mechanism whenever you're doing fullers. What I mean is that as you grind your fuller, if you have any sort of wandering spots, you can go in later with a bevel and pull that spot back and make your line straight. This is something that I learned from Matt Stagmer at his shop whenever I got to go down and take a class with Ilya, which is where I learned most of my Japanese engraving and forging from. Another massive tip that I received when doing fullers is that majority of it is simply just muscle memory. There are lots of blades that I've made up to this point that you've never seen, and most of them have really subpar fullers on them. That being said, I'm really happy with how this one's turning out, and now let's do the bevels.
It's time to grind the sword. Let's do it.
Now, whenever I do bevels, the first thing that I'm going to do is knock down the edge on a really steep angle. That way I can get everything nice and straight when you look down the length of the blade. Then from there, I'm going to go in with a fresh belt and basically pull that line up to the fuller and straighten out all of my lines beforehand, as mentioned.
Whew. We're done grinding the sword. All right.
Now that the blade is about 85% finished, we need to start on the handle. The first thing that I'm going to do is cut out some 1045 round stock for our guard and pommel. Now, in order to forge the guard, I'm basically just going to squish this down into a rectangular piece. In order to do the pommel, I'm going to upset this and stretch it out into a large enough blob that I can grind in our pommel shape later. Once these blanks have been forged, I can take it and begin to clean it off before drilling some holes in our guard. Now, I'm not looking for a perfect fit here. All I'm trying to do is remove the material so that I can then hot fit it onto our sword. In order to do this, I'm going to first clamp the sword blade into the post vise, before heating up the guard and then striking it down on the tang. Doing this repeatedly will essentially create a negative space of where the shoulders of the sword are going to recede into the guard. This is a historical technique and ultimately provides a much better fit than it would had I tried to file it to shape. The next thing to do is to shape the guard now. For this, I'm going to be using a rough grit on the belt and basically just hogging up material until I get down to the final shape that I'm happy with.
That's awesome. All right, let's move on.
After that's been done, we can start to work on the wooden portion of the handle. For this, I'm going to be using a chunk of white oak, and basically drilling out some holes before using a burn-through method in order to get a nice tight fit on the tang. Similar to the hot fitting of the guard, this is also a historical technique, and while I don't recommend this for usual knife making practices, it makes fitting up a sword handle a real breeze.
Aha! Finished handle. It's a little blocky.
Now that that's been fitted, the next step is simply to hog off all the material to get down to our preformed shape before we do our wrap later on. Something I tell people, whenever you're doing sword handles with a wrap, you basically want to grind it to the shape and then go a little bit farther, as you actually want the grip to feel a little bit uncomfortable before you put your wrap on. I do this so that once the wrap is put on, it actually fills out the void of your hand much better. I'm going to move on to hot fitting the pommel as we did before with the guard. This one's a little bit more tricky, but essentially it's the same process of drilling some holes and then heating it up and striking it onto the tang of the blade. And once that fits, the final thing to do is simply to rough in the shape. First thing we need to do is to leather wrap the handle. To do this, I'm going to start out by cutting out some thin strips of leather and basically using some contact cement to put these onto the wooden grip. Now these leather strips are called risers, and essentially they create an aesthetic appeal to the handle as well as improving the grip ability of the sword. Next thing we're going to do is using some cord, I'm going to wrap the handle and create this under texture that'll go below the leather. Once I've gotten these to a point that I'm happy with, I'm going to move on to leather wrapping. For this, I'm going to be using a piece of blue leather. Now this has a decent bit of stretch to it, and so what I'm going to do is once I figure out my template shape for the handle, I'm going to go to the belt sander and basically grind away the edges. This is to thin them out so that whenever we bring the two ends together on the grip, we don't have this really nasty seam. After using contact cement to wrap this around, I'm going to aid the drying process by using some more cord and basically tightly wrapping everything. Not only does this help hold things tight while it dries, but it also helps to imprint the texture upon the leather. Once that's been dried and I've packed the ends down, the grip's pretty much done. So then I'm going to move on to carving out the guard and the pommel. For this, I'm going to be using some files and some sandpaper and a Dremel wheel to basically go through and grind away some of the material. Now, I originally had actually rolled out some gold to do some inlay on this project, but at the end of the day I just settled on this really simple motif, and I'm actually really happy I did. I think it complements the modesty of the sword, which reflects some of the Christian values I had in mind whenever I designed this piece. Now that the handle is completely wrapped up, the final thing is to reveal the pattern on the blade. For this, I'm going to go through with some sandpaper, and I mean spend lots of time sanding this sword. This is by far the most time I've ever spent hand sanding a blade, partially due because I actually used hand sanding to clean up my grinds. Once I got through 220 grit though, 400 and then 600 really weren't that hard to do. I used a small wheel attachment from a belt grinder to be able to hold my sandpaper to contour out the fuller. And then I used a wooden stick with some leather on it in order to round out the bevels down to an edge, which I later sharpened off camera. Now that the blade's been fully polished, we can go ahead and etch it. For this, I'm going to be dunking it in ferric chloride after rinsing it off with soapy water. Now I'm going to go for about 3 cycles here, pulling it out every 15 minutes and scrubbing off the oxides before going back in the ferric. Once this has been done, I'm going to rinse it off and neutralize it before giving it a final polish, first with a polishing cloth and then with a buffing wheel. Now typically I'll do a high contrast etch on most of my Damascus projects. This one I wanted it to be a little different, as I want the pattern to resemble a pillar of fire, and for that I want the entire blade to have a lighter look to it. Once the blade has been completely finished though, now we can do the final step of assembling the sword. Now as I mentioned earlier on in the video, I had welded on a piece of softer steel to the tang of the sword. Well, now we finally get to put that to use by peening the tang over onto the pommel. So after fitting all the parts up to the tang of the sword, I'm then going to go back and forth with an oxyacetylene torch and basically use a little ball peen hammer to pull the tip of that tang down into a rivet on top of the pommel. This is historically how these swords were constructed. It was really fascinating to watch it slowly mushroom down into the finished product. Now that everything has been assembled though, the sword is finished. want to thank you for spending the last few minutes with me. Now, if you liked what you saw, please subscribe, and now go out there and do something you're passionate about. All right, God bless. Bye.